Well, good morning, church family. It's great to be with you today. Today has been a really good day, hasn't it? For a lot of reasons. It's been a good day because my assumption is if you were here at 9 a.m., you had a wonderful Bible class. I know we did downstairs in the young adults class, and I trust you did here upstairs. It's a great day because we have a lot of people in this auditorium this morning. A lot of our church family has returned from traveling. A lot of our church family has returned from being sick. It is great to see Daryl Marla here with us there in the back today, isn't it, church family? It's great to see them. It's also great to see so many visitors, those who have traveled all over and are passing through and are stopping to worship with us this morning, those from our area who are seeking and desiring to learn and to grow. We have so many people here this morning that, in fact, we ran out of handouts and we had to print more. That's a wonderful thing, isn't it, church family? It is a great day. It's been a great day because of the men who have led us in worship. They've done a wonderful job doing that and preparing our hearts and our minds and equipping us with the things that we need to know to worship and to serve our Lord and God. It is great to be, as the psalmist would say, in the house of the Lord. And I'm very thankful to be back with you after our travels. It is good to be here today. I guess you could say the sermon is actually brought to you by Martin today. Martin, a few weeks ago, gave Lauren and I a book. It was a very interesting book, a book of fables and wise sayings. And as I was going through that book, I was reminded of a fable I once heard. And it was the fable of a sparrow who was trying to get to a destination, but as he was flying, a big storm came. And the storm was one that was an intense storm. The wind was strong, and it was so bad that it took the bird out of the sky and caused him to fall down below into this muddy ditch. And that's where the bird found himself. And he was struggling to get out of that ditch as he was wet and tired and exhausted. And the fable goes that as he is trying to escape that predicament, he then sees a beetle beside him who is also having some unfortunate luck. He is also stuck in the mud. He's unable, because it's very wet and slippery, to climb out of this ditch and get to where it needs to go. And so the fable goes that this sparrow sees this, and it decides to help this little beetle, to help the bug. It nudges its way up beside it to the top, and then they both get up there, and they go on their way. But up above there is this hawk, and he's watching this whole predicament. He's sitting from the safety of his nest, the safety of his trees during this storm. And right before the sparrow can go, he says to the sparrow, he shouts from above, "Why'd you help the beetle when you were barely surviving yourself?" And how this fable ends, the sparrow looks up, and he says to the hawk, "Storms really show who you are." And I think it's a pretty profound line, isn't it? I think it's a really good fable, one that barely fills the page of a book, but one we could talk about for hours, couldn't we? Storms are moments in life where you really get to see who someone is at the end of the day. I think we'd all agree that storms in our life, those moments where we were hard-pressed, those moments where we were stressing out, that those moments where we were trying to make ends meet, where we were scared or lonely or exhausted, those were the moments in life where we probably got the best picture ever of who we actually are, the most authentic picture of who we actually are. It's easy in these moments of gratitude, these moments of thanksgiving, these moments in life that are easy to endure, to assume that we have that mountain-moving faith, don't we? To assume things like we're a good human being, that we have a good disposition in life, that we are things like content, that we are things like trusting in the Lord and His provision. But you know as I know that when those storms come in life, that's when we actually get to see if that's really the case, isn't it? I've seen all too often in my life where these moments where I thought I had this really strong faith, but then that hardship came and then that kind of facade washed away, didn't it? And I recognized that I didn't trust God as much as I thought I did. I didn't love the Lord as much as I thought I did. I might have had a little bit more of a transactional relationship more than I thought I did. It's very easy in those moments to think, in moments where we're on the highs of life, to think that we have great dispositions, great perspectives, that we are people with good virtuous qualities of love and care and compassion for others. But you know as I know, that facade can also be washed away in the storms of life. where it's easy to become grumpy. It's easy and natural to become self-focused and self-motivated. It's easy to relax and not care about others. It's really in the storms of life, isn't it, church family, where we get to see ourselves for who we actually are. We are refined by fire to actually figure out who's actually standing in that mirror. So I love that fable. I love that line. Storms really show who you are. And that being said, I want to take our minds to the book of Philippians this morning. Because when it comes to storms in life, when it comes to hardships in life, Paul experienced so many of them. And in the book of Philippians, we really get to see who Paul really is during those storms. We don't just get to see him in those moments of great zeal and great faith when things were going good in his life, but we get a window into Paul's life when everything is crashing around him, when it's hard and difficult. And the question is, as I read the book of Philippians and I get to see that into that window, who's he actually going to be? Is he going to be that same man, or is he going to be a different man? Is he going to be that same man of zeal, love, and compassion for the Lord, or is he going to be something unlike that altogether? And when we get to the book of Philippians chapter 1, Paul lets us know what exactly his suffering, his hardship is. He is in Roman custody during the writing of this book. He is in custody awaiting trial from Caesar. If you remember how the book of Acts ends, the book of Acts ends with Paul appealing to his Roman citizenship. He's been put in prison, he's undergone trials, and he now appeals to Caesar, who we can think of really as our Supreme Court here in America. He appeals to Caesar and says, I want to go see him. Now the thing about seeing Caesar is, if he accepts your appeal, you live. If he denies your appeal, you die. And so the book of Acts ends with this predicament. Paul goes into Roman prison awaiting a verdict from Caesar. Acts 28, verse 16, when he got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. And the text makes clear he'll wait 2 years to face this trial. So just imagine the hardship going on during this book. I think all too often we get really numb to Paul's suffering, really numb to the prison epistles is what we call them. Think about Paul and what he's going through for just a moment. Put yourself in his shoes. For 2 years, you're going to go through the emotional pain of awaiting a trial where you're either going to get a thumbs up or a thumbs down, live or die. 2 years, you're just waiting for that one moment. For 2 years, you're going to be displaced from your normal routine, displaced from freedom. You're going to live under custody in a house arrest system where you're going to be guarded day and night. Think about that for just a second. This is the trial that he's facing. He is not free to move. He's really not free to think as he is facing this trial in prison. This is Paul's sentence. Now, appreciate with me, if that sounds bad enough, think about the difference between their house arrest as he's waiting a trial and our house arrest here in America in 2025. Not same things at all, are they? In 30 AD, 60 AD, when probably this was taking place, they didn't have ankle monitors like we have. They didn't have technology. They didn't have parole officers. How did they ensure that Paul wasn't going anywhere? That Paul was going to stay in his home? Well, what history shows us is they didn't just put guards outside the house. They didn't just put guards in the vicinity of Paul, but actually, as Paul alludes to, and as Luke alludes to in the book of Acts, they're going to guard him day and night by chaining themselves to him, or at the very least standing beside him at every moment. Oxford historian Sherwin White writes this: the custody in which Paul found himself was not the harsh imprisonment of latter martyrdom. It was the custodia militaris, a Latin term, a form of military guard that allowed a prisoner to live in his own hired lodging, though chained to a soldier. Roman citizens awaiting trial often lived in such conditions. Robert Lyon says this: a person under house arrest was expected to provide his own lodging and sustenance. Roman authorities provided the guard, but not the living space. This system made confinement less costly for the state, while ensuring control over the accused. For 2 years, he's not just going to await trial. 2 years, he's not just going to be living this different life, this more confined life where he can't just do the things he wants to do Monday through Friday, right? Think about the picture that we get of Paul's imprisonment. He is a man standing next to him day and night, chained to him. Or at the very least, the most conservative readings and historians say, at the very least, Paul is chained up to a post in his house, and the guard is standing there right next to him. Think about the hardship Paul is going through when he writes this letter. Think about the difficulty he's going through. I might argue that some men, some weak men, couldn't survive that harsh reality he finds himself in. Never being alone, never being free, never being forgotten about, always being chained up to another man, whether awake or whether asleep. Those guards constantly coming in and out as you grow tired and more tired, and they are always vigilant and awake and watching. This is the harsh reality Paul writes this letter in. And so again, the question is that I just began with, what would you expect to find? And what would you expect the storm to reveal? Based on my experience on Monday, when I just woke up grumpy because it was a Monday, I would expect Paul in this kind of situation to be grumpy and to be irritated and to maybe be reserved, right, for the storm to reveal that within him, for him to desire really not to talk to anyone, but just kind of put his head down and get through this situation like most of us want to when we're undergoing suffering. I would expect for the storm to reveal a man who was frustrated with God. God, why are you putting me in this situation? A man who probably just was frustrated with life. You mean that I've got to go through this? I've got to be chained up to these people? Maybe I would expect the storm to reveal a man who is just broken, who is just sad and depressed and angry. But when you read the book of Philippians, and not just chapter 1, but all the way through the book, that's not what you find at all, because that's not who Paul is. This morning I want to bring your attention to some verses that I just absolutely love. And this morning what I'm going to try to do with these verses in the book of Philippians is not so much preach them to you, but allow the verses to preach themselves. This morning we are going to offer some application. This morning we are going to offer some reminders from them. But this morning I truly feel that these verses that show who Paul is, that show his disposition, his actions, his zeal in the storm, I think it does a good enough job on its own to convict you and challenge you and move you. And so what we're going to do this morning, I'm going to read these verses. I'm going to show you Paul's actions and dispositions in the storm, showcasing who he really is, a man who's not just on fire for the Lord in the good times, but a man who in love and zeal and faith is still that in the hard times. And I'm just going to let you take away what you want to and let it challenge you, particularly in your moments of suffering. Church family, look with me, verse 12 of Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 12. Just 3 verses for you this morning, 3 amazing verses that are a window into Paul's suffering. Verse 12. Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that in my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole auditorium guard and to everyone else, and that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Church family, those are 3 verses that I find really interesting, don't you? I find interesting for a variety of reasons. One, I love them because they showcase Paul in the storm, right? They show Paul in that muddy ditch and who he actually is in that moment, right? You see the disposition of Paul. It's not grumpiness, it's not bitterness, it's not isolation or reservation. What's the disposition of Paul in the storm? This is worked out for the greater advancement of the gospel. What is that, church family? That's a disposition of victory and joy, isn't it? Paul isn't angry in this moment. Paul isn't frustrated in this moment. And if you don't believe me, just look at verse 12. What does Paul say? Verse 18, excuse me. Yes, I will do what? I will rejoice, Paul says in verse 18. How's Paul feeling in the storm? How's Paul feeling in the muddy ditch? Paul's feeling great about that, isn't he? Because why? It is a joyous moment where he sees the gospel being advanced, where he sees himself able to be a vessel of God's grace and God's goodness. Paul sees this as a moment where God's divine plans, whatever they might be and however confusing they might be, are being fulfilled in his life. And he says what? I will rejoice. Paul's on fire. And again, that shows you who he really is, isn't it? It shows you a lot about Paul and his trust in the Lord, his faith in the Lord. You see who Paul truly is. Church family, what I find more interesting is not just Paul's disposition in the storm, but in verses 12 through 14, we get to see Paul's actions in the storm. In church family, they're unusual to say the least, aren't they? When you think about your typical actions, when you are tired and exhausted and suffering, when you think about Paul's actions in the storm, they really stand out to me, don't they? What's Paul doing in the storm? Well, he tells us in verse 12 through 14. We'll talk about that here right now. Why is this not a course of action not many people would have taken? Why is it so unusual what Paul is doing? Well, first and foremost, I say it's unusual because of this. It's very natural in the storms of life to turn inward, isn't it? And not outward. What's Paul doing in the storm? Paul is preaching and teaching Jesus to the lost. And church family, I find that very unusual. Very unusual when I just think about me and I think about you when we're going through suffering, don't you? What do we typically do in suffering? What is our natural, intrinsic course of action that typically we desire to take? It's one where we don't turn outward, but one where we turn inward. And we start focusing on what? We start focusing on self-preservation, don't we? We've probably all been in those moments, haven't we, where something is hard and something is difficult in life. And typically, what are we saying in those moments? In regard to helping others, in regard to serving others, in regard to others' people's problems, what are we typically saying? I've got to focus on who first? I've got to focus on me first, right, before I can focus on them. I've got to put my oxygen mask on before I can put their oxygen mask on. I've got to get right myself before I can help them get right. Typically, what are we doing when we're going through suffering? The attention of our focus becomes who? It becomes us, doesn't it? To put it in some therapeutic terms, our body goes into survival mode, not compassion mode, a mode focused on self. And let me be clear, there's a place for boundaries and healing and hardship, but often, a place for healing, but often in hardship, often our body intrinsically says, let's collapse inward. And I'm sure, again, we've all had a time where as we grew tired and we suffered, we faced that temptation not to care about others, but to simply care about ourselves. Again, that's why this text stands out to me. I think we read past verse 12 through 14 all the time and don't think about how weird this is. Paul is going through the hardest suffering that maybe he's ever gone through. He's in prison for 2 years, chained up to someone for all that time, under house arrest with the Roman guards who are growing ever more hostile toward Christians and Christianity. But in that moment, Paul's not doing what? He's not doing the normal thing. He's not saying, I'm just going to focus on myself. He's not just saying, I'm going to take some me time. He's not just saying to the guards next to him, hey, we're not going to talk today because I just want to rest. And says in verse 12 and 13, it makes clear Paul is doing what? Paul is working on behalf of the Lord to spread the gospel to those who are around him. He's taking the time to teach the Gentiles about Jesus, the Roman guards about Jesus. And we'll talk about the significance of that later, just on a quantity level and how many people that actually was. But just appreciate with me the very act at this moment. At a time where his body was probably saying, me, 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 as Paul had done both in the hills and in the valleys, Paul continues to say, you, Lord, and teaches and teaches and teaches the lost. Again, it says a lot about Paul, doesn't it? It's also very unusual to me, this story, verse 12 through 14, because it's also just very natural, based on my perspective in life, just to go along to get along. When we are going through hardship and we perceive future suffering ahead of us. What is a natural course of action? Again, what is our what is our natural course of action? It is at all times to mitigate suffering, to not do things that would potentially increase it. Our human tendency is what? It is to avoid actions that we perceive are probably going to hurt us at the end of the day, that have no reward behind them. It's an intrinsic self-preservation we all have, a tendency we all have. We naturally avoid potentially harmful actions. Actions that we don't have to take, actions that we know we can avoid. And so again, just put yourself in Paul's shoes for just a moment. What was Paul's body probably saying that first day that he was under Roman custody, before he had that first Bible study with that Roman guard? What was his body telling him to do? Well, my guess is your body's probably told you a million times the same thing. How about we not talk about Jesus right now, right? I'm looking at that person in front of me, and how about we not talk about our faith right now? How many times have you experienced that, whether with an atheist, whether with a friend, whether with a coworker, and that self-preservation takes over, recognizing this could get dicey, this could get hard, this could get ugly, so how about we just not do this today? Church family, I bet Paul was feeling that before that first Bible study. I bet he was feeling that because why? He was under Roman prison for essentially being a Christian. He was under lock and key with guys who were becoming notoriously more hostile toward Christianity and faith. I bet he was probably feeling that because they had clubs in their hands and they had the authority to beat him if he got out of line and said things they didn't like to say, or he didn't like for them to hear and for him to say. Church family, I bet his body was saying a lot of things in that first moment, in those first days in custody, out of self-preservation. I bet his body was saying, hey, let's just go along to get along. Let's not talk about Jesus. Hey, I can write these letters to the churches. I can do this great work still. And Acts tells us there were still Christians coming into that home, and he was preaching the gospel to them. Why don't I just focus on the brethren for now? And I'm not going to turn my attention toward that guard and ask him some questions about his faith, his love for Jesus, his relationship with God. I bet his body was just saying, let's go along to get along. Let's avoid suffering. Let's not rock the boat here. And also think about it. This isn't just like a one-time encounter. If he brings up the gospel and it goes bad, right? Often we find ourselves in those predicaments, and they're hard enough. Think about it. 2 years in prison, and you're going to keep seeing these people over and over and over again. If it goes bad, it's going to be a really bad time in prison, isn't it? But yet Paul doesn't do the natural thing. The thing that I think we all too often do because of who Paul was and who the storm revealed him to be. In faith and love for Jesus, Paul did the unusual thing. He didn't whisper his faith, but he spoke about it openly. He proclaimed to these men who it was he served. The topic of Christ was not avoided in Paul's home. It was the topic of choice for Paul. Paul chose a path to forgo a path that would probably mitigate suffering, certainly avoid the risk of suffering, but instead he chose the path many wouldn't. I also just think it's an unusual story, verse 12 through 14, because it's also just natural to make assumptions and thereby just ignore people when it comes to exerting energy and time and effort into evangelism and teaching the lost. Church family, when it comes to the guards, what do you think Paul, again in those early days, what do you think his body just naturally was telling him? It was naturally probably whispering in his ear some assumptions about these men. That these men would probably never come to Christianity, so why bother? I bet your body has said that once or twice to you, hasn't it? As you've seen lost people in front of you. How could you not have that assumption if you're Paul? How could your body just naturally not come to that inclination if you're Paul when you're, again, sitting beside men, chained up to them because you are a Christian? When you are sitting next to men who it is their job at the end of the day, at the very least, to guard you, to not speak with you, to ignore you, to maintain authority over you, and to keep watch over you. How could Paul not have that natural thought that often our body tells to us, even here today? They would never become Christians. So why bother speaking Jesus to them? Why bother when you're tired, Paul? Got a lot of things going on. Why bother when you're exhausted? Why bother when you're stressed about the trial? Why bother when you got all these things that you need to be doing for the churches of Jesus and writing letters? Why waste your time with them? Because why on earth would they become to King Jesus? They probably won't. And again, I love this story because Paul again and again does the unusual thing. It would have been natural to assume that these men were hostile, closed-minded, or simply that they're just to do a job, not to be there for a Bible study. But Paul didn't ignore them. But instead, out of his love, his faith, and his zeal for Jesus, because that's who he is, he again serves and serves, and he is like his Lord and Master Jesus, who didn't make assumptions, but went to those who were lost and sat at their table. Church family, it's an amazing story. In Philippians chapter 1, 12 through 14, isn't it? It's an amazing just to see into that window, isn't it? Where Paul is suffering and going through hardship, and to recognize who he actually is in that moment. A faithful servant of Jesus, not with a transactional relationship, not with a conditional relationship, not with weak faith that struggles in the waves and in the storms, but a man of mountain-moving faith and love for Jesus that served him at every moment. It's an amazing story, isn't it? Now, let me just ask you the question this morning for us to consider. What's the result of him doing the unnatural thing in the story? Verse 12 through 14. What's the result of Paul in that faith, in that zeal, in that love for Jesus, every day speaking with these men who were chained up to him, or speaking to these men who were beside him every day, keeping watch over him? Church family, Paul says it best. The gospel was advanced. And I would argue Paul's being a little bit modest here in Philippians chapter 1. Church family, the gospel isn't just advanced in Philippians chapter 1, 12 through 14. The gospel burst forth in Philippians chapter 1, 12 through 14. Think about all the people who heard the gospel and came to King Jesus because of Paul planting the seed of the gospel in that home and in that living room with those men. And we don't know exactly the number. We don't know how many souls were baptized because of Paul, but we can speculate about how many people just heard the gospel, and it's pretty amazing. Church family, on a conservative estimate, Paul says the whole Praetorian Guard heard. On a conservative estimate, historians argue that would have been 4,500 people in the whole palace guard of the Romans. Men would have heard Paul, and they would have been on a daily rotation, hourly rotation, and those men would have taken it to their friends in the company, their friends in the regiment, and it spread forth and forth. 4,500 souls heard the gospel because Paul did the unusual thing in love for Jesus. On a less conservative estimate, but on one that is taken by many more people, it's a more popular estimate, people speculated would have been about 9,000 people in the company of the Praetorian Guard and the Palace Guard. Think about that for just a second. And just imagine 9,000, or just we'll say 5,000 people heard the gospel. They had that seed planted on their heart, the story of Jesus and His love and His grace and forgiveness and the plan of salvation. Imagine how many people they took it to, right? Imagine if just 1/5 of those people who heard the gospel, those soldiers, they took it to friends and family and children. You just got 1/5 of that group. You got another 1,000 people who heard the gospel because of Paul doing the unusual thing in house arrest. But also think about how that story ends. Because it's not just the Praetorian Guard who heard the gospel because of Paul, but who else heard the gospel because of Paul? It was ordinary people in ordinary life. Because Christians, it says, saw Paul, and they saw how he was standing up, and how he was being a light in darkness, and how he was having the courage to speak and to do that unusual thing. And what does Paul say? Because of my imprisonment, now those everyday Christians in the church, they're doing what? They're getting up off the sidelines, and they're doing the unnatural thing now, and the unusual thing. Church family, think about it for just a moment. How many people heard the gospel because of Paul's faith, love, and zeal for King Jesus in doing the unusual and unnatural thing? The answer is countless. Thousands and thousands and thousands heard the gospel. And I can only imagine how many of those people were baptized and how much rejoicing there was in heaven because Paul planted the seeds in prison. Again, it just shows you who he really is. It shows you how amazing it is. And like I said, I think that passage can do a lot of preaching just to you and how we should act and how we should operate. Let me give you just two reminders this morning. Two reminders, two things to consider as we leave here based on the book of Philippians, based on Paul's actions, based on the text we read. First is this. I think this is a great moment to ask ourselves, what does the storm reveal us to be? My guess is there's a lot of people this morning going through hardships and going through difficulty, and what I just want to lay on your chest this morning and lay on your heart this morning to consider is that question we began with the fable. What has the storm revealed you to be? Church family, again, storms are very good at revealing who we actually are. Our faith, our virtue, our fervor for the Lord, perhaps unlike any other moment. It reveals very quickly transactional discipleship, poor mindsets, a lack of divine perspective. Church family, the storm of Paul's life revealed him to be a man of God, a man of character and virtue and faith and dependency on the Lord. It did not reveal shallow faith, and quite literally revealed the exact opposite, a faith that was mountain moving. So church family, let me just ask you as we conclude this morning, what have the trials of your life shown you to be? And what are they showing you to be right now? Are they showing contentment? Are they showing virtue? Are they showing character? Are they showing a mission mindset like Paul, whether I'm going through hardship or whether I'm going through good times, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain? I'm going to go teach the gospel to the lost. Church family, what have the storms revealed in our life? And today I pray that if they're not revealing that picture that you like, and that's often the case, today you work on that. Second reminder is this. Are you in a storm with the opportunity for the gospel? I think often when we get into these storms of life, it's very easy to lose focus of the divine realm and the spiritual battle before us. I think it's often very easy to get wrapped up in the moment and not consider why the Lord has brought us to this moment and brought us into this place. Church family, Paul was in a great storm. And it's in that great storm that Paul did amazing and mighty things for Jesus. Just think about it for a second. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. If it truly was 4,500 people, and that's the low end, this is one of the greatest evangelistic stories in all of Scripture, church family. Only next to Pentecost, where 3,000 souls were baptized in a single day. Yet it wasn't done on a mountaintop. It wasn't done in a synagogue. This evangelistic story didn't take place in some familiar territory or some friendly auditorium. It took place under house arrest, not standing in a pulpit, confined to a living room, not preaching to a crowd in a courtyard, but the gospel still advanced. And again, it's one of the greatest stories in all of Scripture from an evangelistic standpoint. Church family, I'm reminded when we think about this story, God often turns the darkest rooms into the brightest pulpits. What should have smothered the gospel in Paul's life become the very place it thundered the loudest. And so what I just want you to consider this morning, particularly if you're in a valley, if you're going through a hardship, if you are suffering here today, I want you to consider a question that maybe you've never thought about before. Is this a moment where there is opportunity for the gospel? And what I've noticed in my short life, and this is just my perspective, whenever there is suffering, I think there's always opportunity for the gospel. As you are introduced to new people you wouldn't have met otherwise, doctors and financial experts and neighbors and first responders, whatever it might be. As you go through difficulties and you're forced to lean on family who aren't Christians and speak with them and become regular acquaintance of them, maybe unlike you have been. Church family, there is always opportunity for the gospel in times of suffering. That's not the question here today, but the question is, will I take advantage of them? And if we are the person God calls us to be, if we are that person who doesn't have transactional faith but has that mountain-moving faith, that doesn't have just that zeal on the hills of life but that zeal in the valley, has that mindset of Paul, for me to live as Christ and to die is gain, whether good times or bad times. Church family, I am assured this morning that the storm will reveal us to be faithful and a zealous servant, but also reveal that we made the most of the time the Lord gave to us, and I pray you do that this morning. Church family, I love the story. I love the story of Paul. I love his faith. I love his zeal, and I pray that we desire right here, right now, that his story will be a story that we try to replicate in our life. This morning we want to end with an invitation to anyone who might not yet be a child of God. I pray this morning that in some way I, like Paul, have just laid the gospel at your feet to recognize that there is a way of hope and assurance and joy. The plan of Jesus is very simple. As Caleb talked about this morning, as he read for us this morning, Jesus did all the work. He paid the price so that you could be freed from your sin. He went to Calvary, He died for you, and all He has asked now that you respond to that. You lean into His grace and mercy. You be washed in the waters of baptism, and you rise to a newness of life. No longer a child of the devil and a child of self and the old man, but now a child of God, freed by sin. If you are subject to that invitation this morning, come forward right now as we stand and as we sing.